The space station called Haven's Reach was not a pretty place. It was big, loud, and smelled like a dozen different worlds crammed into one metal box. It floated in space between two suns, one orange and one pale white, and their light came through the thick observation windows in strange double shadows. Ships docked and left all day long. Cargo floated through sealed tubes. Alien voices mixed with human voices in the long curved hallways, and nobody paid much attention to anyone else. That was the rule at Haven's Reach. You kept your head down and did your job. Commander Leon Wade was very good at keeping his head down. He had been a military officer for 16 years, and he had learned early that the best way to survive in a room full of powerful people was to speak only when spoken to and move only when needed. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with close-cut dark hair going gray at the sides and a face that showed very little of what he was thinking. The other officers respected him. The alien delegates found him unreadable. That was exactly how he liked it. What Leon had not planned for was the small hand wrapped tight around two of his fingers. His daughter Cora was 7 years old. She had big brown eyes and a gap in her front teeth and hair that refused to stay in its braids for more than an hour. She was supposed to be back on Earth staying with her Aunt Kate. But Aunt Kate had broken her ankle 2 days before the Iron Dawn was set to launch, and there had been no time to find another option, and so Cora had come along. She sat through the entire briefing on proper diplomatic conduct without moving. She had also, Leon later discovered, spent that same briefing drawing small pictures of aliens on the back of his mission notes. The Iron Dawn docked at Haven's Reach early in the morning station time. Ambassador Vera Hollis led the human delegation down the boarding ramp with her chin up and her gray coat perfectly pressed. She was a short woman, but she moved like she owned every room she walked into. Behind her came Dr. Pete Calloway, the team historian, carrying 2 bags and already sweating. Then came the security detail. Then came Leon, with Cora's hand in his. The docking bay was enormous. Delegates from other worlds moved through it in clusters. Leon spotted the insectoid Virith almost immediately, their long segmented bodies clicking softly as they walked. Near the far wall stood a group of Corran war delegates, massive and gray-skinned, built like something that had never needed to run from anything in its life. Cora stared at all of them with open curiosity. Leon steered her gently forward. The station liaison, a Virith named Jacques, met them at the end of the ramp. His translator device hummed softly at his throat. He welcomed Vera Hollis with a formal gesture, 6 arms moving in a practiced pattern. Then his large compound eyes moved to Cora, and he paused for just a moment before continuing. The pre-summit reception was scheduled for the following morning. Vera used the first evening to walk the human delegation through the agenda. Leon stood near the door and listened with one ear, keeping the other on Cora, who was sitting very quietly in the corner and watching a tiny food delivery drone float back and forth across the room. It was Jacques who found Leon after the briefing ended. The Virith moved quietly for something with 6 legs. He waited until Cora had wandered a few steps away before speaking. He told Leon that all registered delegates had arrived. And then he said a name. Orcs. Leon had heard that name exactly once before, in an old file he had read during training. He had assumed it was historical. A story told to make cadets understand how dangerous the wider galaxy could be. He looked at Jacques. The Virith's compound eyes did not blink. Leon understood that the name was not historical at all. Cora appeared at his elbow. She had found a small cracker somewhere and was eating it calmly. She looked up at her father's face and then at Jacques. She asked who Orcs was. Leon put his hand on the top of her head and told her it was nobody she needed to worry about. His voice was steady, but his hand was not. The Grand Hall of Haven's Reach had been built to impress. The ceiling was 3 stories high and curved inward like the inside of a seashell. Long banners hung from the walls, each one carrying the symbol of a different member civilization of the Galactic Coalition. The human banner was near the back. It was not the only one placed there, but Leon noticed it. The pre-summit reception dinner was not really about eating. The food was there, spread across long tables in the center of the hall, but most of the delegates were not looking at it. They were watching each other, measuring, deciding who mattered and who did not. Leon had been in enough diplomatic rooms to recognize the pattern. The power in a room like this did not live in the speeches. It lived in the small moments. Who made eye contact first? Who turned away? Cora, sitting beside him at the edge of the human table, had already eaten 2 small pastries that were technically from the Virith table and had no business being in her hands. Leon had decided not to ask how she got them. Dr. Pete Calloway settled into the seat across from Leon and opened a thin reader on the table in front of him. Pete was a careful man, the kind who read everything twice and spoke slowly because he wanted every word to land correctly. He had spent 3 years studying galactic history before this posting. Of all the people on the delegation, he was the one Leon most trusted to know things that actually mattered. Leon asked him quietly about Vorix. Pete looked up from his reader. He glanced at Cora. She was busy balancing a small spoon on the edge of her cup and appeared to be paying no attention to the adults. Pete had children of his own and knew better than to trust that look. He kept his voice low. He told Leon what he knew. Vorix was not a legend in the way that legends usually worked. Legends were stories told about things that had already ended. Vorix had not ended. It was old beyond any simple number, a creature of a kind that the Galactic Coalition classified as a void dragon, which was less a scientific term and more an admission that nothing else fit. It had been alive before most of the civilizations at the table tonight had learned to make fire. It had watched empires grow and collapse the way a person might watch seasons change. Pete pulled up a record on his reader. He spoke through 3 items without raising his voice. 3 planets, destroyed, over as many centuries. 2 full armadas dissolved, not defeated in battle but simply stopped, as if the idea of them being a threat had become something Vorix found too small to bother with. 1 moon, leveled entirely, because an envoy sent to negotiate had used a disrespectful tone and Vorix had responded the only way it ever responded when it chose to respond at all. It did not communicate often. When it did, it communicated in whatever language it chose, and the meaning arrived whether you wanted it to or not. Elder Suleth moved close to Vera Hollis at the far end of the table. The Sethari Elder was ancient even by the standards of a species that lived long. Her scaled skin had gone pale with age, and she moved slowly, but her eyes were sharp and they had seen more than most. She spoke to Vera quietly. Leon caught the edges of it. Suleth had been alive when Vorix last came to a summit, 400 years ago. She remembered what had happened to the lead ambassador of the Drenathi Empire. She said the ambassador had made the mistake of holding eye contact for too long. Vorix had decided that was a challenge. The summit had ended that same day. Pete told Leon that the coalition had invited Vorix this time because it had no other choice. Vorix controlled access to something called the Calith Corridor. 17 civilizations depended on that corridor for trade and transit. Without access, several of them would face serious shortages within 2 years. Nobody had managed to build an alternative route. Nobody had tried very hard, because everybody understood that Vorix owned that corridor the way a mountain owns a valley. You did not argue with it. You worked around it, until you could not. Now they could not. A small voice came from beside Leon. Cora had put down her spoon. She was looking at Pete with a serious expression, the kind she got when she had heard something and was turning it over in her mind. She said that Vorix sounded lonely. Pete stared at her for a moment. Then he looked at Leon. Leon looked back at him. Neither of them had an answer for that. Nobody heard Vorix arrive. That was the first strange thing. At Haven's Reach, every ship that docked triggered a soft chime through the station's alert system. It was standard. A formality. The kind of sound that nobody really listened to anymore because it happened so often. But when Vorix came through the specially constructed outer dock on the station's far side, no chime played. No alert fired. The station systems received something they could not classify and simply went quiet, the way a person goes quiet when they hear a sound they cannot place and their brain tells them, without words, to stop moving. The first sign that something was different was the lights. Across the entire station, every light dimmed at once. Not off. Just down, as if the station itself had taken a slow breath and not let it out yet. The temperature dropped 11 degrees in under 2 minutes. Leon felt it through his uniform jacket and saw Cora pull her arms close to her body without saying anything. In the corridors, delegates from a dozen worlds stopped walking and stood still. The Virith touched their mandibles together, a gesture Leon had learned meant deep unease. The Corran War delegates, beings the size of ground vehicles who had never in recorded history shown discomfort at anything, took 3 slow steps backward from the corridor entrance and did not seem to notice they had done it. Then Vorux came through the main passage into the grand corridor. It was not what Leon had imagined. He had imagined something monstrous. Something with too many teeth and too much noise. Vorux was not noisy. It was the opposite of noisy. It moved through the corridor with a slowness that felt deliberate, each step placed with the kind of patience that only comes from something that has never once had to hurry. Its body was enormous, easily the length of a short-haul cargo hauler, with scales that shifted between deep black and a cold violet depending on how the light hit them. Its wings were folded tight against its back, so tight they looked almost like a second body wrapped around the first. Its eyes were the thing Leon could not look away from. They were the color of collapsed stars, dark at the center with faint rings of cold light moving outward from the pupils. They were not cruel. They were not angry. They were simply old, in a way that made every other old thing Leon had ever seen feel like it was brand new. The electromagnetic field Vorux produced was not something you could see. You could only feel it. It was the feeling of standing too close to a transformer, a low hum that settled into the bones and did not leave. Several delegates put their hands over their ears even though there was no sound. One of the Sethari aides pressed herself against the wall and closed her eyes. A Virith clerk dropped his datapad and did not pick it up. Vera Hollis stepped forward to deliver the formal welcome. Her voice only shook once, on the second word, and she pulled it back before anyone could be certain they had heard it. She was a professional. Leon watched her and felt something close to admiration. Vorux did not respond to the welcome. It moved its enormous head in a slow arc, taking in the corridor, the delegates, the banners on the walls. Its gaze passed over the Korund, passed over the Sethari, passed over the Virith, passed over the humans. Then it stopped. Leon felt the gaze land on him the way you feel a change in air pressure. It was not threatening, exactly. It was just the feeling of being seen by something that had no reason to pretend it was not looking. He held very still. Beside him, Vera continued the formal welcome in a slightly faster voice. Behind him, Pete was typing notes with fingers that were moving too quickly to be calm. Leon had his hand on Cora's shoulder. He could feel her there, warm and solid and very quiet. She had been quiet since the lights dimmed. He thought she was frightened. He thought she was finally, for the first time in this entire trip, behaving like a sensible child who understood that some things were genuinely dangerous. He was not paying enough attention. He felt her shoulder shift under his hand. Then she was not there anymore. He looked down and Cora was already 3 steps ahead of him, walking forward, toward Vorux, with her arms loose at her sides and her braids swinging and the calm, purposeful walk of a child who had made up her mind. Leon moved. But Jaquetha's hand closed on his arm, not cruelly, just suddenly, the grip of something that had frozen in place and grabbed the nearest solid object without meaning to. It held Leon where he was for 1 second. Long enough. Cora walked the way she always walked when she had decided something. Not fast, not slow. Steady. Like she had thought about it and the thinking was already finished and now the only thing left was the doing. The corridor was completely silent. Not the silence of an empty room. The silence of a full room where every living thing had stopped breathing at the same moment. The Virith were still. The Sethari aides were pressed back against the walls. The Korund were delegates, beings that had stood on battlefields without flinching, stood exactly where they were and did not move and did not speak and did not take their eyes off the small human child walking toward the most dangerous thing in the known universe. Vorux watched her come. Its head lowered as she got closer, a slow movement, the way a mountain might shift if mountains could shift. The electromagnetic field around it pulsed once. The lights in the corridor flickered. The temperature dropped another 2 degrees. Cora walked through all of it without changing her pace. She stopped when she was close enough to reach out and touch the ridge of scales along its jaw. She looked up at it. Vorux looked down at her. Its eyes, dark as collapsed stars, focused on her face with the kind of attention that it had given to nothing else in that corridor. Cora said, in a perfectly ordinary voice, that it looked sad. She asked if it was okay. Nobody breathed. Vorux was silent for a long moment. Its pupils contracted slightly. The electromagnetic hum around it changed in some way that none of the xenolinguists present could describe later except to say that it became different. Not weaker. Just different. Cora reached up. She was not tall enough to reach the jaw without help, so she grabbed one of the large ridge scales near the side of its face and used it to pull herself up on her toes. She was not rough about it. She held on the way a child holds a fence post when they are leaning over to look at something on the other side. Then she pressed a small, simple kiss to the end of its enormous snout. The kind of kiss given to a stuffed animal before bed. The kind given to a scraped elbow to make the pain feel smaller. It lasted less than a second. Then she stood back on her heels and looked up at it and said that her dad made a scary face when he was sad too. She said it did not mean he was mean. The silence in the corridor had weight. It pressed down on everyone in it. Leon had stopped trying to move. He was not sure when he had stopped or whether it had been a decision. His heart was going very fast. His hands were cold. He was watching his daughter stand in front of Orcs the Undying and tell it about his face, and he did not know if he should be terrified or if he had passed beyond terror into something else entirely. Vorax did not move for a very long time. The delegates watched. Jaquetha's 6 hands were clasped together at his chest, all 6 at once, a gesture Leon had never seen the Virith make before and did not have a name for. Elder Suleth stood very still with her aged eyes wide open and her mouth pressed into a thin line. Pete, somewhere behind Leon, had stopped typing. Then something changed in Vorax's expression. It was not a smile. The face was not built for that. But something in the set of its eyes shifted. Something in the way it was holding its enormous body shifted. The tension in it, the coiled, ancient quality that had made the air feel dangerous since the moment it entered the corridor, became something slightly different. Not gone. Just changed. It made a sound. The sound came up through the floor before it reached the ears. Low, resonant, felt in the chest like a deep bell struck once. It was not a roar. It was not a growl. It passed through the corridor walls and into the bones of every living thing present and settled there. It took 3 days and 4 xenolinguists arguing in a small room to confirm what the sound was. When they finally agreed, they wrote it in the official record carefully, with a note explaining that they had checked the classification 4 times. It was a sigh. The summit began the next morning. Vorax sat at the far end of the grand table in the summit chamber, and nobody chose the seat closest to it. There was a gap of 3 chairs on either side, left empty without any discussion, just a quiet mutual agreement between every delegation that certain distances were reasonable. The chandeliers above the table had been adjusted to their lowest setting. Nobody asked why. Everyone understood. Vera Hollis presented the opening terms from the human delegation. Her voice did not shake once. Leon sat behind her and kept his eyes on the room. Cora sat beside him, drawing again, this time a series of small dragons along the margin of a station map she had found somewhere. Vorax participated in the summit. That alone was enough to change everything. It had attended the previous summit 400 years ago and killed someone in the opening hour. This time it sat, and it listened, and when it chose to speak, it spoke. Its voice came through the translation system as a low, even tone, not warm but not cold either. Just present. Just there. Every delegate in the room was aware of it at all times. Even when they were not looking at it, they were aware of it. But the quality of that awareness slowly changed over the 2 days of the summit. In the first hours, it was the awareness of prey. By the second morning, it had become something more like the awareness you have of a very large and very unpredictable weather system. You did not forget it was there. But you also started to believe it was not going to move in your direction. The Calith corridor negotiation was the last item on the agenda. Everyone had expected it to be the hardest. The human delegation had prepared 3 separate frameworks, each one designed to be acceptable to a different range of outcomes. Vera had spent weeks on them. Pete had annotated every page. It took 2 sessions. Vorax proposed a framework that none of the human delegation had considered, and none of the other delegations had either. It was structured to benefit the smaller civilizations first, the ones that depended on the corridor most and had the least ability to manage without it. The major powers got access too, but on terms that were clearly secondary. Nobody argued. Nobody asked for changes. Jaqueth signed the agreement with all 6 hands moving at once, the fastest Leon had ever seen the Virith move. After the final session closed, the delegates began to filter out of the chamber in small groups. Vorax did not leave. It moved, slowly, toward the outer observation deck of the station, the long curved platform that looked out over the two suns and the dark space between them. The station's lights dimmed slightly in the areas it passed through, then came back up after it had gone. Leon found Cora already on the observation deck. She was sitting on one of the low benches near the window, and she was talking. Talking the way she talked at home, easy and relaxed, with her feet swinging and her hands moving to help the words along. She was telling Vorax about Captain Bubbles, her pet fish, and about how Captain Bubbles had once jumped out of the tank and survived on the bathroom floor for almost a whole minute before Leon got him back in the water, and about how she thought that was very brave for a fish. Vorax was listening. Whether it understood was hard to say. But it was low to the ground, its enormous head turned slightly in her direction, and its eyes were on her face. Leon sat down beside Cora. He did not say anything for a while. Outside the window, the two suns burned against the dark, one orange and one pale white. After a long moment, he asked Vorax how old it was. Vorax told him. The number came through the translator as a unit of time that meant nothing until Pete, later, spent 2 hours converting it. He came back with a number that translated to roughly 9 million years, and he sat down quietly and did not speak for a while after that. Cora looked up at Vorax with a thoughtful expression and said that was a really long time to not have any friends. Vorax looked at her. Seconds passed. The twin suns burned. Somewhere below them the station hummed and clicked and carried on. Then Vorax said one word. The translator rendered it simply and plainly. It said, yes. The Iron Dawn departed Haven's Reach the following morning. Leon stood in the doorway of Cora's small bunkroom and watched her sleep, one arm around the small stuffed rabbit she went nowhere without, her braids undone and spread across the pillow. She looked exactly like what she was. A 7-year-old who had had a long week and needed rest. Jacques had found Vera Hollis before the ship departed. He had told her something that she later shared with Leon. In 4 centuries of summit records, Vorax had attended 2. The first time, it had destroyed the summit before it ended. The second time, it had sat through 2 full days, proposed the fairest trade agreement the Calith corridor had ever seen, and listened to a child talk about a fish. Vera had asked him what had changed. Jacques had looked at the door Cora had walked through a few minutes earlier, and he had said that a human child had done what 6 armadas could not. She had not looked at Vorax and seen a weapon or a threat or a problem to be solved. She had looked at it and seen someone having a bad day. In the years that followed, the Galactic Coalition updated its first contact protocols 3 separate times. The changes were technical, mostly. Procedures for new species, guidelines for contested zones, language around resource rights. But buried in Section 7, in plain language that any reader could understand, was a single new directive that had not existed before the Haven's Reach summit. It read, "Do not underestimate the diplomatic potential of human children."